Hello, good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7 here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart, and I'm delighted once again to be joined this very Tuesday evening with William Duguid, a great friend to the programme. William, welcome to tonight's smorgasbord of media things that have been missed in the news.
Well, I'm looking forward to snacking over many bits of it. Thank you.
And
Nice to be
indeed,
here.
and it is a night, a day that has been very much filled with turmoil in the Labour Party, anti-refugee laws being passed, an attempt to ease Brexit turmoil, interesting enough, also in trying to deal with economic turmoil, and also internationally in Iowa and Victoria, if you've not already heard, in the BBC with mental wellness. And as always, we begin with the turmoil in Ukraine on day 510 of the illegal Russian attack on the sovereign state of Ukraine. Russia's defence ministry said today that it had carried out overnight strikes on two Ukrainian port cities in what it called a mass revenge strike a day after an attack on the Crimean bridge, which it blamed in Kyiv. Russia has pulled out of the Black Sea grain deal and did so yesterday. The deal was brokered by the United Nations and Turkey a year ago, which was designed to alleviate a global food crisis by allowing Ukrainian grain to be exported safely. Moscow has said that their decision is final. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the grain deal must continue and could operate without Russian participation. Furthermore, Poland's Agriculture Minister Robert Telus said that Russia is using the grain as ammunition. And Kyiv reported a complicated situation in fighting in eastern Ukraine and success in parts of the south today as it pressed on with its counter-offensive against occupying Russian forces. General Alexander Syrsky, commander of Ukrainian ground forces, said on Telegram that Russia had concentrated forces in the direction of Kupiansk in the northeastern region of Kharkiv, but Ukrainian troops were holding them back. In its latest intelligence update on the conflict, the UK's Ministry of Defence has said that both sides have achieved marginal advances in different areas over the past week. According to the RIA news agency, the Russian Defence Ministry has said that Russian air defences and electronic countermeasure systems downed 28 Ukrainian drones over Crimea this morning. The ministry has said that the drone attacks caused no casualties or damages. Russian state-owned media is reporting that Russian Federation security services claim to have detained a woman on suspicion of preparing a terrorist attack in the Yaroslavl region to the north of Moscow. Germany's military has ordered several 100,000 artillery shells in a deal with Rheinmetall as it works to replenish stocks dented by the war in Ukraine. According to a monitoring group, more mercenaries from Russia's Wagner military contractor arrived in Belarus on Monday, continuing their relocation to the former Soviet nation after last month's short-lived mutiny. Belaruski Hajun, a Belarusian activist group, said a convoy of more than 100 vehicles carrying Russian flags and Wagner insignia entered the country, heading toward a field camp that Belarusian authorities have offered to the company. US President Joe Biden will meet with Pope Francis, peace envoy, today as part of the Holy See's peace and humanitarian initiatives for Ukraine. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi's two-day visit to Washington follows his recent mission to Moscow and an earlier stop in Kyiv, where he met with President Zelensky. William, the news continues, rolls on in terms of Ukraine. I was noticing one of the news reports showed you that the map is a sizable part of Ukraine that Russia has managed to eat into. So this counter-offensive, not unsurprisingly, is finding life pretty difficult.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at gains and good things and bad things on both sides from a military perspective. And it feels very much like a bit of a stalemate. And I think if Ukraine is to get the territory back that it's lost control of, then it'll take a long time and it'll take a lot of effort and bloodshed, and there's no real getting round that. Um, I think that at some point the geopolitics has got to kick in to make this move along, because it's again now having an impact on the world at large with the cancellation of the Black Sea grain deal. And that is a concern, because it accounts for a big amount of food to certain parts of the world, and a way is going to have to be found of restoring that. So amidst all the stalemate, there's still areas of concern, and yeah, I don't know how this ends even yet.
And it's interesting you mentioned the food grain deal, because that's clearly something, particularly in Africa, there's a great deal of dependence upon that particular route to get food into the continent. And Russia has said this decision is final. Is that a hardening of attitudes because they believe that there's some merit in it, or is it a hardening of attitudes because Putin may well be beginning to lose some grip on what is happening in his own country?
We don't know for sure, do we? But it seemed to be, it probably wasn't, but it seemed to be, because of the timing, a reaction to the bridge bombing and possibly some of the early gains made by Ukraine in the counter offensive. And it is a weaponization very much of the world's need for food, and particularly areas like Africa. So, yes, it could be looked at as hinting of desperation. Whether it actually is, or whether it's just playing hardball to keep things rolling along, is yet to be seen. I hope it's resolved in some way or another, but I do fear that there will be increasing temptation for NATO maybe to get involved in defending the food convoys, so to speak, and that could lead to escalation. So we're going to tread very, very carefully here. Whatever Putin may be feeling in his head, he remains very unpredictable, and I suspect capable of much more than he's already done.
Indeed, and we go from playing hardball and losing control internationally to news today that the SNP has said that Keir Starmer should reconsider scrapping the two-child cap, amid a growing backlash over the Labour Party's admission it would keep the UK government's two-child cap, despite it being one of the leading causes of poverty in the United Kingdom. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn has called for Keir Starmer to reverse his decision. In a letter to Keir Starmer and Anna Sarwar today, the Scottish Labour leader, Stephen Flynn MP described the decision as utterly shameful, and both party leaders were asked by him to come clean on whether the Labour Party will keep other UK government policies, including the wider benefit cap, the £20 a week cut to the universal credit, the bedroom tax and the local housing allowance freeze. Multiple anti-poverty and children charities have condemned the UK Labour leader's decision. Child Poverty Action Group Scotland stated that the two-child cap is one of the most brutal policies of our times, and that it affects over 80,000 children in Scotland alone, pushing up to 15,000 into poverty. Across the UK, 1 in 10 children are affected, they said. Well, Bernardo's called it one of the leading causes of child poverty. Action for Children Poverty have said that any government serious about tackling child poverty will eventually have to confront the cruel reality of the two-child benefit cap. And Peter Kelly, the director of Poverty Alliance, said the two-child cap is the worst of the welfare reforms of the last 13 years, and that any politician that claims to care about poverty, about increasing food bank use, about the well-being of kids, needs to commit to scrap this terrible policy. Well, Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar said he would press a future Labour government to scrap the policy, and other senior party figures publicly broke ranks and suggested they would fight the policy. Shadow Secretary of State for Digital, Cultural, Media and Sport, Lucy Powell, defended the move, stating yesterday in an interview with Sky News that we've opposed this policy. This is not a good policy. We've opposed it for many years through Parliament, but we're in a very different economic situation. However, in his letter, Stephen Flynn MP wrote that the Labour Party is abandoning working families and those with disabilities and caring responsibilities to poverty and hardship. He added that people across Scotland are increasingly asking the question What is the point of the Labour Party if it can't be trusted to scrap the most damaging Tory policies and is willing to push people further into poverty by imposing benefit cuts, Brexit, and real-term cuts to public services? And further stating that the two-child cap undermined the Scottish Government's efforts to reduce poverty in Scotland. William, increasingly I'm keeping an eye on the Conservative Party policy of today because it would appear to be the Labour Party policy of tomorrow. This is quite an astonishing thing, is it not?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's a U-turn by Keir Starmer, and it's another illustration of Anna Sarwar being left on a branch that's gradually being sawn off. He's had terrible trouble defending um, uh, the decision and saying, well, it'll be all right in the end. We just aren't going to get round to it immediately because there isn't enough money. And this seems to be okay, despite the fact that it's universally, I think, in terms of poverty fighting organisations, universally regarded as an absolutely terrible poverty policy and one of the underpinnings of child poverty. Reversing it, which I think would cost 1.3 billion a year, and that would have the effect of radically reducing child poverty. It would lift 250,000 out of poverty immediately, 250,000 children, that is, and a greater number out of really deep, serious poverty. So if your raison d'etre is to reverse poverty and to increase the good things happening to the vast majority of people as fast as you can, this is a great way of doing it. I do not understand why it isn't a priority.
Indeed, and I suppose in a sense, for us in Scotland, the Labour Party have been a mainstay for working class people for decades, up until they lost complete faith. Or, as I've quoted many times, I did not leave the Labour Party left me, said so many. This is, it feels like an appeal to an English group of voters in areas that should be naturally Labour Party supporting. And once again, there seems to be a cultural difference, which Anna Sarwar is stuck in the middle of, between a Labour Party centred in London looking in order to become a government in Westminster, and a Labour Party in Scotland attempting to reclaim its place as a left-leaning force for good. And one wonders if that tension can ever actually be tolerated.
I don't think it can. It's quite clear that Keir Starmer will rip up whatever he needs to in order to get elected, and he feels quite comfortable moving on to the policy ground of what used to be the centrist Tories, because the Tories have themselves moved out to the right. I think he's doing potentially everything he can to lose the coming election, or at least to get it down to maybe a hung parliament, and that really ain't good enough. Labour should be making great gains in the polls and looking at a huge victory at the moment, because the Tories have been an unmitigated disaster. And yet, Keir Starmer seems to want to play it as cautiously as he possibly can. And it doesn't make sense, because it will lose them support from what should be their heartland supporters. And that includes people who left Labour in Scotland with a heavy heart, because they're just not the party they were cut out to be originally. So I don't know where Labour go with this. It'll be very interesting to see the results of the 3 by-elections in England this week. I'm going to be looking mainly at the turnout, because where by-elections are normally used to kick the ruling party squarely in the bahookie, I'm not quite sure what sort of impact is going to be made. I think a lot of people might just want to stay at home, because Labour are not really playing this well at all.
Indeed, and I, like yourself, I'll be watching with interest on Friday morning to see what the overall picture suddenly becomes, because you can imagine that 3 by-elections are likely to return a mixed picture. If there are going to be Labour gains, it's going to be claimed by one party as being a radical recentering of the future, and will be a tick in a shiny box for them over what they're doing. And then for the other party, they may well be saying, well, of course that's what's going to happen. That's what we expected. But the low turnout means that, when it comes round to the general election, we're going to get these seats back in some way. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, isn't it? And I think that the issue for Scottish voters, of course, is that, as we see consistently, when you vote for something in Scotland, it does not necessarily translate to something in Westminster, which is something that you actually wanted to see happen.
Absolutely. I don't think that Labour is going to recover as well in Scotland as it believes it will. It may well do okay in a Westminster election, but when it comes to Scottish elections, unless Labour can radically set out a vision that they can actually implement without being pulled up by head office, then they will continue to struggle with the electorate. Now, what the electorate does about that, I don't know, because in many respects, the SNP is having its problems at the minute. So, what are the alternatives? But the voters will find a way in the end, and it won't necessarily be to Labour's benefit, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And not to anybody's benefit today, news that the illegal migration bill is now set to become law. Though the illegal migration bill encounters significant opposition from the House of Lords, it is now set to go for royal assent and become law. The legislation, which has been the cornerstone of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's pledge to stop small boats crossing the English Channel, was met with a series of demands for amendments from the House of Lords, which have now largely been dropped. The law will prevent people from claiming asylum in the UK if they arrive through unauthorised means. The government is also aiming to promptly remove detained people and send them back to their country of origin or a third country, such as Rwanda, though this is currently subject to legal challenge. Jenny Jones, a Green Party peer who had tried to stop the bill, told LBC Radio on Tuesday morning that it was unworkable, shameful and embarrassing for Britain. While Enver Solomon, the chief executive of the Refugee Council, said that the overall bill remains unworkable and will lead to human misery and huge cost to the taxpayer. We believe from detailed analysis that in the first 3 years it will leave almost 200,000 men, women and children left in limbo, detained or destitute on UK soil. Coinciding with this, the barge named the Bibby Stockholm, that will supposedly house 500 asylum seekers, arrived at its destination in Portland Port in Dorset this morning, and it was met with two rival groups protesting its docking. Stand Up to Racism and No to the Barge were both present next to a small beach just outside the port gates. While Stand Up to Racism argued that it was inhumane of the UK government to cram the 500 men onto the barge, which was originally designed for only 200, and accused ministers of whipping up hostility against asylum seekers, No to the Barge argued that the asylum seekers living on the barge would pose physical danger to women and children in the area, and complained that local services would be overstretched. Members of Stand Up to Racism said that the other group promoted far-right views and strongly criticised them for suggesting there was a risk Portland's women and girls would be raped by the asylum seekers. Police told organisers to move their group away from the other and prevented the two sides from coming together again. Downing Street defended the use of barges to house migrants, insisting that it is a cheaper alternative to housing them in hotels. But a recent report claimed that it would save less than £10 a person a day. The first people are expected to board the Bibby Stockholm later this month. William, two groups, two opposing sides of the argument, both united in not wanting it. But I think we all know that this is it's inhumane to put them in a hotel, never mind inhumane to put them in a barge. One wonders what would have happened in the 1930s when the Kindertransporten arrived in the UK had this government been in power.
Well, they were very different times, of course, and I don't particularly like the times we're living in. The only sensible route out of this is to have an efficient and humane resettlement policy for refugees and asylum seekers, to deal with their cases quickly, and if they're not to be staying, then to have arrangements with other governments where they can be taken where there is perhaps room for them. But if they are going to stay, also review the cases quickly and integrate them into society. Not favouring them in any way, as the far right wolf, the dog whistles, not wolf whistles, the far right dog whistles say, but actually integrate them into society, because in many cases, and thinking back to the Vietnamese boat people, they will be an asset to society. This kind of approach is very much, it is supposedly a money-saving one, but it looks like a false economy. And it's just not, it's like fighting small boats with big boats, isn't it? It's not the right thing to do if people are going to be there for months on end. You could just about defend it if it was a short-term, temporary thing while cases were dealt with. But the system is not being properly funded, and therefore it's taking far too long. And it needs a wholesale review and a different approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was hearing this week that something like 15 months ago, the backlog of applications was somewhere in the region of 12, 15, 20,000, tens of thousands in essence. And with typical government efficiency, they allocated increased resource to it, and now it's in excess of 100,000 in terms of the backlog, leading to months and months and years of waiting to gain some kind of answer. And we've had the Windrush generation, we've had, you mentioned the Vietnamese boat people, I talked about the kinder transport, we've also huge numbers of migrants in Scotland from Italian communities, Polish communities, particularly during the war, Czechs and so on, and the Chinese and the Indian subcontinent, which have developed a rich stream of Scottish culture. Heavens above, we are responsible in Glasgow for the most popular dish for many years, chicken tikka masala, being created in Glasgow. There's plenty of evidence that when we open our arms, that we gain benefit from it. But it just appears this big boat, wee boat, simplistic nonsense is, you're right, it's a dog whistle. And again, is this an attempt to stay in power in desperation because they believe that out there is a white man van with a load of votes ready to stuff them in a ballot box for them?
Yes, I think the decision was taken long ago, right back to Theresa May's hostile environment, and I wouldn't necessarily at that time have pegged her as a far right operator, but certainly I think the Tories see this as a possible way forward for them. Yeah, let's make let's other people, shall we? Let's just blame immigrants for everything, blame asylum seekers, and say they're being favoured when, in fact, in reality, there's no way they're being favoured. They're having a terrible time. They're having a traumatic experience, and we are not helping them by banging them up in ships like this. And we say we spend so much money on it. We don't spend it efficiently, we don't spend it on the right things, and we don't do it sensibly. It's always the government answer. We've spent so much money. I would like to hear what they're doing with the money and why, and how they think that works. And we don't get that from politicians. Instead, as you say, it's the dog whistles.
And we go from what we don't get from politicians to something that we have got from politicians. The United Kingdom government has relaxed visa restrictions for sectors facing severe worker shortages. Construction jobs such as bricklaying, plastering and roofing have now been added to the UK government's shortage occupation list, which already includes care workers, engineers, web designers and laboratory technicians, along with healthcare roles, due to ongoing labour shortages caused by Brexit. Fishing jobs as well as bricklayers, masons, roofers, roof tilers, slaters, carpenters, joiners, plasterers and other construction workers have been added to the list. The Independent Migration Advisory Committee had recommended in March that construction workers be added to the shortage occupation list, and people working in a shortage occupation role can receive 80% of the job's going wage and still get a skilled worker visa, as well as benefiting from a lower application fee, though they will be required to have a sponsored job offer from an employer and meet English language requirements. This decision has led Rishi Sunak to face further criticism from Conservative MPs due to previous pledges to reduce immigration. Overall migration to the United Kingdom reached a record high of 606,000 last year, with the asylum case backlog also at an all-time high. Brexit has overall worsened the worker shortage in construction, as EU citizens can no longer work in the UK without a visa. Added to this, many workers returned to their home countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. William, we go from housing people in boats to allowing people in because we're short. One would almost think, surely to heavens, it would be a lot easier if you just put your hands up and said, this is a mess, we got it all wrong, can we just forget about it and go back to the beginning?
Well, that would be a lovely thing if it were to happen, but the Tories are never going to do it this side of an election, and probably for some time to come. And Labour aren't going to be putting them under any particular pressure, because the Labour view of Brexit is that we need to do it just a wee bit better. We had something that was working. We really did, and now we've wrecked it, and we're trying to make piecemeal changes to try and get things back in an even keel. But if you're paying people 80% of the going rate, are they necessarily going to want the jobs? They don't have to come over and take the jobs. The great increase in immigration seems to me, having looked at it, to be mostly, or at least a large proportion of it, people coming here to study. They're not coming here to work in these sort of industries, and they're certainly going to be less likely to do it if they're getting 80% of the money. And the other side of the coin, which comes from Tory politicians saying we should train up the British folk to do this. Well, I don't think the money is quite good enough for people either, particularly with the cost of living crisis and all the other pressures. So we've taken a situation that was working and we've made it into a complete mess. And I don't necessarily think that this relaxation is going to help very much. I think there are still going to be shortages in those industries, as there still is in others. And things will go on continuing to get worse until some politician somewhere takes the bit between their teeth and, opens up the gates once again to proper freedom of movement and reciprocal job arrangements with Europe at the very least.
And I suppose again we go back to the connection between the disconnection between both Scotland and England, where if you're looking to vote for a political party in Scotland who wishes to rejoin the European Union and reverse what has happened with Brexit, it's quite clear where to go to. If you wish to do that down south of the border, there's nobody of any import at all. So you are left in an anti-democratic place insofar as ain't nobody going to take your vote if you want to go back to freedom of movement, to the single market and so on.
Yeah, I really wouldn't want to be making the choice in England right now. I mean, even the Lib Dems, bless them. Well, I don't normally bless them in Scotland, but let's say bless them for the by-elections this week. I'm sure they'll have some fun. But the Lib Dems are even going a wee bit soft and let's get back into this. And they're never going to get the power anyway. I don't know what the percentage right now is of people who would vote to get back into the EU, but I suspect it's considerably over 50 and probably going northwards, because like everything of this nature, the bad effects don't all come at once. And there are alleviations that go in temporarily that make it really get you into a sort of frog boiling scenario where you don't realize the trouble you're in until it really hits. And over the next 2 or 3 years, it will hit even more if something isn't done. And right now, nobody wants to, and nobody is even in a position to change it on the political side in England. And I despair about that. I hope that we in Scotland can make the most of the opportunity we do have to do something about this, because it is an opportunity and we would benefit from it so much.
Indeed. And the Liberal Democrats do confuse me a little because of all the UK political parties. I think we would all have said that the Liberals and the Liberal Democrats were the most pro-European of parties. And where there is a possibility the Labour Party doesn't recover as well as it believes it might, that in a hung parliament, to be sitting there with sufficient numbers of seats where you were pro returning to the European Union, you could actually be in a position of great power. And they seem to have just left that by the wayside.
Well, maybe they thought they were in a position of great power in 2010, and it didn't quite work out that way. They got their referendum on the voting system, but it was a very, very, can I say, half-assed. It was a bad proposition, and it didn't get support, and it wasn't a well-conducted referendum. That was their price for power then, and they made a mess of it. And they actually sacrificed many of their other flagship policies, such as tuition fees. So it wasn't a good experience for them in 2010, and I suspect that may be something to do with their reticence now.
Indeed. And reticence all round. On our next item, as the IPPR report has come out to say that public sector pay rises of 10% would add little to inflation. That is the Institute for Public Policy Research. They have said that raising pay by 10% on average for public sector workers would not add significantly to inflation. This comes following Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's announcement last week that a pay rise of at least 6% was the final offer for teachers, nurses, doctors and police, and that there would be no further negotiations, regardless of the threat of further strike action. Sunak had argued that union demands were unrealistic and would damage the government finances and increase inflation, hence his reticence. However, the IPPR's report says that a settlement of as much as 10.5% could restore public sector pay to pre-pandemic levels, taking inflation into account, and would only add 0.14 percentage points to inflation at most if funded by higher borrowing. The effect would be almost zero if the pay increase was financed from taxation. The think tank highlighted a triple crisis in the public sector as successive years of pay rises that were below inflation have hit the standards of living of public sector workers and contributed to a recruitment and retention crisis that undermines the quality of services. England's NHS has more than 100,000 empty vacancies, and recruitment into teacher training in the country is 40% below the Department for Education's targets. The IPPR stated that even Sunak's proposed 6% pay settlement meant that the average public sector worker would be £1,400 worse off this year compared to before the pandemic, as wages have not kept pace with increasing prices. Research from the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, shows that the finance and business services sector is the only sector of the economy where pay levels have managed to outstrip inflation since the 2008 financial crisis. Annual growth in public sector pay has accelerated in recent months to 5.8%, the fastest rate since 2001. It still lagged behind the private sector by the largest amount on record last year and was significantly lower than in the rest of the economy. The latest official figures showed private sector wage growth at 7.7%, while inflation has remained high at 8.7%. A government spokesperson said its pay awards were the highest for 30 years and were broadly in line with pay growth across the economy. They said they are fair, responsible and sit alongside further work to improve retention in the public sector. High inflation is the most destabilising force in our economy, eating into paychecks and slowing growth, and further borrowing to fund these pay rises would only prolong the pain. William, the pain in here is the idea, surely, that actually paying people what they deserve should be the beginning of the discussion, not the conclusion.
Yeah. Who says that inflation is the most destabilizing thing? I think falling living standards are pretty destabilizing. I think really poor public services, because people leave them and they become underfunded, is bad for the economy. I think there's all sorts of things that you might be prepared to take the risk on inflation, even if it were going to increase as a result of this, just while you got things back on an even keel. But the IPPR has done the figures, and it does not have a significant effect. And the reason for that, I believe, I'm an avid reader of Richard Murphy on this. Richard Murphy would say that the multiplier effect would come into play. If somebody gets a pay rise, they pay more tax, they pay more national insurance, and they spend the rest of the money, which, when it gets into somebody else's hands, means that they pay more tax, and more individuals, more businesses pay tax, and so it goes on in a beneficial cycle. That's the multiplier effect. It's not just putting extra money into the economy so that it can speed up the rate of inflation. It actually greases the wheels of the economy so it works better. And this is from a government that was quite happy to be paying £40 billion a year more in interest payments to the banks on the deposits that they hold with the Bank of England. That was the case 2 years ago. They're not worried about spending the money on that. I think that to get the economy working again, we need to be looking at proper pay. And I'm glad to see some of the settlements the Scottish Government is looking at, particularly with regard to the healthcare workers in that regard. And I hope that they accept that, and that provides some sort of inkling about what the good effects can be of doing things sensibly.
And of course, whilst there is significant staff shortages, the debate, particularly for Westminster, of finding some sort of efficiency drives, basically cuts, because the public sector is not managing to achieve the things it's supposed to achieve, allows the spectre, the haunting of privatisation. Because what we do know is that, particularly politically, private companies have the ability to provide statistics that can outshine anything because of their shiny portfolios. When in actual fact, as we discover time and time again, when public service is sold out, what happens is that private companies benefit, and the people who don't are the people who depend upon those services.
Yeah. I mean, look at water in England for the absolute prime example of that. Privatisation does not work in producing better public services because it's a rigged game. If it was a genuine sort of increase in competition or in competitiveness, then that might make a difference, perhaps. But we live in an era where public services are getting worse and worse, by and large, every year, and that has to be reversed. And we should be looking also at, in terms of productivity, in terms of making services better, wouldn't actually paying people properly tend to add value to those services by increasing their productivity, or at least their enthusiasm to do things as well as they possibly can, and to find ways of doing them better, make it worth their while?
And we go from enthusiasm to the unenthusiastic news today that up to 3 million people in the United Kingdom who are behind on bills have experienced mental health problems. According to research from YouGov for the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute charity, 12% of those who participated in its poll were behind on at least one bill payment, such as energy or rent or credit cards, and half of those people had a mental health problem. The authors calculated that this means there are around 3 million people who are behind on a payment and have experienced a mental health problem in the past 2 years. Overall, the report found that those who have experienced mental health issues over the past 2 years are 3 times more likely to be behind on at least one significant bill. 60% of participants said they felt unable to cope because of the rising cost, but only 9% have received money or debt advice since the cost of living crisis began. The Money and Mental Health Policy Institute suggests that the UK government could save over £140 million a year and double the recovery rates of people with depression and debt by linking mental health and money support. It has called for the UK government and NHS England to provide practical financial advice in tandem with NHS talking therapies. According to the charity, it is possible that this approach would help an extra 27,000 people recover from mental health problems each and every year and reduce waiting times for mental health services, reducing demand on health and social care and positively impacting the economy and workplace productivity. Chair and founder of the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, Martin Lewis, said that the cost of living crisis shows no sign of abating, and even if it does, the fallout will last years. Financial problems and mental health issues are locked together. It's about time treatments were linked too. Adding that for many years, therapists, mental health nurses and social workers have told us they often spend substantial, valuable clinical time helping people with their finances. It makes more sense to leave debt help professionals to do that and take some pressure off the NHS, letting clinicians focus on helping people get better. It's another one there in terms of, we've been hearing for years that this is an issue and it's linked, and one imagines that one of the reasons why people are not seeking out a lot of help is because they don't believe that that type of help exists out there, because many charities and many frontline services are deprived of funds due to the current crisis that we're in.
Yeah, we're in a vicious circle of our own with regard to that. And the people that are in debt are in a vicious circle as well. It could be that because of their mental health condition, they can't cope so well with bills and household finances. But equally, being under financial pressure is in itself going to affect their mental health. And that also just continues to drag them down. And I think increasingly the answer has to be, and it has to be funded right. That's very important. A holistic approach and a collaborative approach with people who can give them the advice they need, and maybe just a society that's a wee bit less punishing of people who are in financial trouble and maybe helps them out, is more ready to help them out than the one we've currently got. So I'm glad that this has been picked up. I'm not sure anything will be done about it, but I think the conclusions are absolutely right.
And from there to something where potentially not a lot has been done about it is to do with large PPE contracts. And today, the large PPE contracts with a firm linked to a Conservative peer has been described as being involved in panic buying. The Public Accounts Committee, PAC, have said that part of a COVID procurement process described as panic buying included the award of large PPE contracts to a company linked to Conservative peer Michelle Mone. In a report which is currently limited by the ongoing National Crime Agency investigation into the company PPE MedPro, the PAC emphasised its general criticism of the government's procurement strategies and the VIP lane implemented that gave high priority to PPE offers from companies with political connections. PPE MedPro received 2 contracts for face masks and sterile surgical gowns costing a total of £203 million after Mone first approached Michael Gove, at the time the Cabinet Office Minister, in 2020 and offered to supply PPE. The PAC reported that internal documents from the Department of Health and Social Care, the DHSC, offered only a snapshot of the procurement process, and it could not say whether PPE MedPro had been treated differently to other companies in the VIP route. It stated that contracts were awarded through the government's generally flawed processes following the suspension of normal procurement rules because of the COVID emergency. In its urgent rush to buy PPE, the DHSC reportedly accepted very high levels of risk, and even if some offers or companies were suboptimal, it bought the PPE anyway, with limited safeguards. The PAC report on DHSC documents followed a piece from The Guardian revealing that in November 2022, Mone and her children secretly received £29 million originating from PPE MedPro's profits, according to leaked documents produced by HSBC, the bank. Mone's husband, Isle of Man-based financial services businessman Douglas Barrowman, received around £65 million from the PPE MedPro profits, according to the documents, and paid the £29 million into an offshore trust for Michelle Mone and her 3 adult children. Mone and Barrowman have, over the past 2 years, repeatedly insisted they had no involvement in PPE MedPro and no role in the process through which the company was awarded its government contracts. PPE MedPro is the subject of an ongoing investigation by the National Crime Agency, which has said it opened in May 2021 into suspected criminal offences committed in the procurement of PPE contracts by PPE MedPro. William, if it quacks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, is it a PPE contract that has been given to somebody's friend and they have pocketed the readies on the back of it?
Well, as I'm sure the investigation continues, and I'm not going to say anything definitive because you never know how it might turn out. What I would say is having no clear pandemic strategy and therefore being forced to do things in a hurry and maybe shutting out some of the firms who could give a more considered view of what they could do in favor of people coming to them and possibly lobbying for the business who may or may not have been their friends. If it wasn't fraudulent, it was wide open to fraud. And it really is important that there is a considered strategy for the next time where this can't happen. And where, if there is a pandemic, we know who the suppliers could be, and we have things already in place, in outline for them to ramp up their efforts. And that was really the big failing with the government with regard to PPE. And we shall see, as part of the COVID inquiry, how that develops in terms of reporting, perhaps.
I suppose, there is an argument if you were down the pub and you needed a wall built and you knew a brickie, that, it would be the normal state of affairs that you'd go to him and say, do you fancy building my wall and I'll pay you? And that, in a sense, is just millions of pounds on top of that. But, if you're getting somebody to build a wall outside your front door, you're taking your own money to pay over. This is government money, which basically is on the back of taxpayers' money, which is everybody's money. And that is where the stench, I suppose, comes from.
Yes. Yes, it may turn out that the inquiry says, oh, there's nothing to see here, but there could have been, because the actual way in which things were being done was conducive to potentially fraud and this kind of thing happening. And it's a great difference between building a wall outside your house and keeping the population safe in a pandemic that could have been predicted, because it was predicted, and at a time when the government had actually rolled back the preparations that it had been making and basically wasn't ready.
Indeed. And talking of rolling back, an Iowa judge today has temporarily blocked the state's new 6-week abortion ban, thus rolling back the draconian measures that were being put in place. And this is days after Iowan Governor Ken Reynolds' new law banning abortion after 6 weeks was temporarily blocked on Monday, meaning abortion is once again legal up to 20 weeks into a pregnancy. The new law prohibited almost all abortions once cardiac activity could be detected, which is usually around 6 weeks of pregnancy and before many even know they are pregnant. In an uncommon all-day special session last week, the Republican-controlled state legislature approved the law, resulting in a legal challenge from the ACLU of Iowa, Planned Parenthood North Central States, and the Emma Goldman Clinic. Yesterday's ruling specifies that while the law is temporarily paused, the state's Board of Medicine should proceed with creating rules for its enforcement, meaning that guidance for healthcare providers would be well defined if the law were to be in effect in the future. There are limited circumstances under the new law that would allow for abortion after the point in a pregnancy where cardiac activity is detected, such as rape, if reported to law enforcement or a health provider within 45 days, incest, if reported within 145 days, if the fetus has a fetal abnormality incompatible with life, or if the pregnancy is endangering the life of the pregnant woman. Judge Seidlin specified that his ruling hinges on the undue burden test, which is an intermediate level of scrutiny that requires laws to not create a significant obstacle to abortion. Using that standard, abortion advocates are likely to say the new law violates Iowans' constitutional rights, Seidlin said, leading to him granting the temporary block. Most Republican-led US states have drastically limited abortion access since the US Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, handing authority on abortion law to the states. More than a dozen states have bans with limited exceptions, and one state, Georgia, bans abortion after cardiac activity is detected. Meanwhile, in the Court of Appeal in England today, a woman who was sentenced to 28 months in prison for terminating her pregnancy after the legal limit has been released from prison today. Carla Foster, who had been convicted of using abortion medication at home beyond the legal time limit, had her sentence reduced to 14 months and had it also suspended. Jemima Olchowski, the chief executive of the Fawcett Society, said that after months and months and months of harm being done to her and her family, we've got to a better place. But it should just never have been necessary for her to go through that in the first place. In the UK, abortion is legal at a licensed clinic or hospital for up to 24 weeks. In 2020, during the COVID pandemic, abortion pills were made available by post for those seeking an abortion in the first 10 weeks of their pregnancy. Obviously, what she had taken advantage of, but out with that period of time. It is very much a polarising topic in America. It's not so polarising in the UK, although this case did sort of highlight where we are kind of stickily on it. And I think that it is a very, very difficult one. Here we are, two men of a certain age, having a discussion that may lead us into talking about a woman's right to choose, which makes it slightly uncomfortable. But I suppose as allies of people who have the right over their own bodies, it is important that we all chip in with our views and opinions. And the Supreme Court in America has thrown several cats amongst several pigeons with their ruling.
Yes, and it's actually become very slightly chaotic because by removing abortion as a constitutional right, then it's thrown it back onto the states and it's become a political football in all of those states. And Iowa is not significantly different from other states, and there will be states to follow. And this will come up in court again because it is a temporary injunction against the new law, and it will be tested for sure in the court. I would think, though, that the reasoning is fairly sound, because if you cannot have an abortion because you didn't know you were pregnant before a deadline, then that's tantamount to effectively being a full-scale abortion ban. And I don't think that will stand the test of time. But there's a lot of litigation to go and a lot of politics in the States to go before we get to a conclusion on this, I'm afraid.
Lots of litigation and politics in America, heaven forfend. And we go from a political football to the wider sporting world, as the 2026 Commonwealth Games will now no longer be held in Victoria, Australia, as they have withdrawn as host of the 2026 Commonwealth Games, stating that it was not prepared to spend around $7 billion on a 12-day sporting event. The Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, said the costs had blown out from the earlier estimate from $2.6 billion, and that his government would redirect the money into regional housing, permanent sporting infrastructure and a proposed upgrade to Ballarat's stadium. The Commonwealth Games Federation voiced its displeasure, saying that it was only given 8 hours notice of the Premier's announcement. Further stating that since awarding Victoria the Games, the government has made decisions to include more sports and an additional regional hub and changed plans for venues, all of which have added considerable expense, often against the advice of the Commonwealth Games Foundation and Commonwealth Games Australia, CGA, they said in a statement. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese told reporters that the decision was made by the Victorian government and he would leave details to them. When asked if the decision was an embarrassment, Albanese pointed to Australia's fine record of hosting events, citing the upcoming Women's Football World Cup and the 2032 Olympics in Brisbane. Other Australian states have ruled out hosting the Games. Andrews stated that they had looked at the cost of moving the Games to the state's capital, Melbourne, but added that it would have cost more than $4 billion to do so. Andrews said the government has had an amicable and productive conversation with the Games authorities in London, and they have been informed of the cost issues, adding that any costs associated with cancelling the Games was the subject of negotiations with the governing body. This has come completely out of the blue, William. I was quite, my gas was flabbered when I saw this.
I'm sure the Commonwealth Games Authority's gas was flabbed as well because they claimed to have had only 8 hours notice of it. This budget has ballooned considerably. It was something like 2.6 billion, and that was just about doable. Uh, uh, Australian dollars we're talking about, and now who knows, 6 billion, 7 billion, and they've just pulled the plug. Um, it's not the first time Commonwealth Games funding have been an issue. There was a big issue in Edinburgh in 1986. And in 2022, Durban, of course, had it stripped because they couldn't meet the financial obligations, and Birmingham got it. And I suspect there might be one or two British cities looking to maybe walk into the gap here. But yeah, it's a surprise. And I think it's going to reverberate about Australian politics for a little bit as well, because noticeably the Prime Minister is washing his hands of this and turning it almost into a mini devolution issue, which I'm going to find totally fascinating, I'm sure.
Indeed. And we end this evening with news that there is a review of the BBC licence fee model, which is to be expected in the autumn, as UK government ministers are expected to formally announce a review into the BBC's funding model in order to assess the advantages and disadvantages of a variety of options. The annual report from the BBC, which was published last week, revealed that the number of active licences had fallen by 500,000 to 24.4 million since last year. With the reduction in licences, the BBC made £3.74 billion in fees last year, which was down from £3.8 billion the year before. The broadcaster blamed the increasingly competitive media landscape for causing increased financial pressure. Licence fees are currently set to have the largest increase in 20 years in April next year after the 2-year freeze. The BBC's Royal Charter, which sets out the corporation's mission, purpose and funding model, is also up for renewal in 2027. The Times reports that the review of BBC funding is expected to examine all options for the future of the corporation, with the front-runner option being a partial subscription model, where some premium content is paid for, while the bulk of the corporation's output remains free to air. The review also plans to assess whether the BBC could make more money commercially. BBC Studios, the corporation's production arm, made £240 million in profit last year. Advertising, which is currently not carried out on BBC channels because of the licence fee, is reportedly also being considered. A spokesperson for the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport said, "We remain committed to reviewing the licence fee model ahead of the next charter period to explore the potential for alternative ways to ensure the BBC remains appropriately funded over the long term." William, the BBC has not had an easy time of it. It looks as though they're going to have some serious questions come October to answer.
Yeah, and it may not now be a coincidence that the Sun pushed the Hugh Edwards story the Friday before the Times published this story. And yeah, the BBC is under attack. Now, as you might expect, I'm no particular friend of the BBC, but I think there must be a sensible answer to this, and I don't think advertising is the answer. There may be some sort of form of subscription or a broadband levy might work. I really don't know, but I'm getting a feeling that maybe the enemies of the BBC are lining up a wee bit and getting themselves organised. So it will be an interesting thing to watch, and it will be absolutely free to watch that. I can assure you. So watch this space, as they say.
Yeah, and you can watch this space free, of course, because that's us got to the end of all our stories for this evening. And it just remains for me to thank you very much, William, for once again joining me in the studio for an evening of fantastic discussion and chat. Thank you.
Nice smorgasbord. Thank you very much.
Indeed, and that is the end of our smorgasbord for this evening. But before I go, and you know what's coming, so do me a favour and stay with me for a wee while, because I want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, as we were just discussing about the BBC, we depend, unlike the BBC, on the generosity of our supporters. We don't have a subscription system, but what we do have is a number of people who generously donate. And to everyone who has done that, who's making a regular monthly payment, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very, very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay bills. and ensure that we are able to continue making programmes. We have raised over £9,000 so far, but we really need to raise the remaining £21,000 as soon as is practically possible. Otherwise, the opportunities that we have in order to give to people are going to disappear. And on top of that, if you're also able to publicise this, whether you're on some form of social media and you see that we are, please like and send on, if it's the YouTube channel, subscribe, make sure that people know what we're up to and where we are, so that they can add to the numbers who will be watching both live and in playback. The way in which you build a movement in order to seek and achieve change is to start by ensuring you have the very first step. So if you want to be part of our first step, please come and help us by either donating and subscribing for a monthly contribution, volunteering front of camera or behind the scenes here at Broadcasting Scotland, or support us by getting the message out through whatever channels you can. But from me, Donald C. Stewart, here at the Broadcasting Scotland studio, on behalf of everybody here, it's good night and thank you for watching.